Rome, 274 AD. A soldier reaches into his money pouch and pulls out a denarius. The coin is familiar in shape, familiar in weight, but something is wrong. He bites it, as soldiers did, and his teeth find not the soft give of silver but the hard resistance of bronze beneath a thin silver wash. The coin is a lie. It has the face of the emperor, the legend of the legions, the authority of the eternal city, but the silver is gone, bled away across a century of quiet, incremental theft. Nobody declared a crisis. Nobody posted a notice in the forum. The empire simply needed more money than it had, and so it made more money than it was worth. The soldier pockets the coin. What else can he do? But somewhere in the back of his mind, something shifts, the kind of distrust that does not announce itself but never quite leaves. That moment is not a Roman story. It is the story. It happens in every empire that has ever borrowed its way to greatness, and it follows the same sequence with a mechanical precision that should unsettle anyone paying attention. Empires do not collapse from the outside first. They collapse from the ledger outward. The currency is always the first casualty, always the early warning, and almost always ignored, because the very mechanism that destroys it feels, in the short term, like a solution. By the time this video ends, you will be able to read that mechanism in real time. Not to predict markets. Not to time any trade. But to see the architecture of decline the way an engineer sees a cracked foundation, clearly, before the roof falls. Begin with how empires are actually built. Every great monetary power in history rose on something real, a constraint, a discipline, a commodity, a trading advantage that made its currency worth holding. Rome's early republic enforced strict limits on money creation because it had to. The denarius was silver, and silver had to be mined. The Spanish crown in the 16th century became the world's reserve issuer because the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia were pumping roughly 300 metric tons of silver per year into Seville by the 1590s. England built sterling credibility on the gold standard formalized after 1717, when Isaac Newton, serving as master of the mint, fixed the gold price at £3.17 and 10.5 pence per troy ounce, a peg that held, with interruptions, for 2 centuries. Sound money is not virtue. It is constraint. And constraint, counterintuitively, is what makes a currency worth crossing oceans to hold. Then comes expansion. An empire that controls trade routes, colonies, or military reach generates surplus, and surplus generates ambition. Ambitions require armies. Armies require money the treasury does not yet have. The borrowing begins, quietly, reasonably, with every intention of repayment. Rome's legions pushed into Dacia, Britannia, Mesopotamia. Spain fought the Dutch revolt for 80 years. Britain financed the Napoleonic Wars on credit. Each expansion was economically rational at the moment of decision. The problem is that expansion creates interests, and interests create constituencies, and constituencies do not accept budget cuts. The spending becomes structural. The debt becomes permanent. And then, eventually, the moment arrives when the state faces a choice between default and debasement, between admitting it cannot pay and quietly making the currency worth less so the debt shrinks in real terms. Every empire in history has chosen debasement. Not because the leaders were stupid. Because the incentives made it the path of least resistance. This is where the mechanism turns vicious, and it has a name, the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon, writing in the 1730s, observed that newly created money does not enter an economy evenly. It enters at a point, the court, the treasury, the politically connected, and ripples outward. The people closest to the source spend the new money before prices adjust. The people farthest from the source, the farmer, the soldier, the saver, receive the money only after prices have already risen. Debasement is therefore not a neutral tax. It is a transfer. Wealth moves from the periphery to the center, invisibly, without legislation. The Roman state paid its soldiers in debased denarii but collected taxes in goods and gold. The French revolutionary government issued assignats, paper notes backed by confiscated church land, beginning in 1789. By 1796, the assignat had lost approximately 97% of its face value, and the government was printing notes worth billions that bought almost nothing. The people who received the first assignats profited. The peasants who received the last ones were ruined. The Cantillon effect does not care about borders or centuries. It is physics. Which empire do you think we are most like right now? Tell me below. Now consider what happens when the debasement accelerates, when the printing press runs not to plug a gap but to service the debt created by the last round of printing. Germany's Weimar Republic between 1921 and 1923 is the textbook case, but it is important to understand the mechanism rather than just the spectacle. Germany entered the First World War financing its costs through debt, not taxation, fully expecting victory to make the creditors whole. When defeat arrived instead, the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles at roughly 132 billion gold marks in 1921 compounded an already broken balance sheet. The Reichsbank began monetising the debt. By November 1923, $1 exchanged for approximately 4 trillion German marks. Workers were paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before the afternoon prices erased them. The velocity of money, the speed at which each unit turns over, accelerated into a self-reinforcing spiral. Each day of inflation taught holders of marks to spend faster, which drove prices higher, which drove velocity higher still. The clock did not slow down. It ran faster and faster until the mechanism broke. Think of a currency like a candle borrowed against future light. When the borrowing is moderate, the candle burns normally. When the borrowing doubles, the flame is turned up. The room is brighter, which feels like prosperity. But the wax is disappearing faster than the light suggests, and the people holding the candle at the end, the savers, the pensioners, the creditors denominated in the old currency, are left with a stub that no longer reaches the wick. There is a false belief embedded in every one of these collapses, and it is worth naming precisely because it repeats verbatim across centuries and civilizations. The belief is this: we are different from the empires that failed before us. Our institutions are stronger. Our economy is more complex. Our creditors are too dependent on us to walk away. The Roman Senate believed Aurelian's currency reforms would restore confidence without requiring real fiscal restraint. The French Directory believed the assignat was different from mere money printing because it was backed by land. The Weimar government believed foreign creditors would accept the logic of an impossible reparations schedule and restructure willingly before the crisis became terminal. None of them were stupid. All of them were wrong in exactly the same way. The belief that one is the exception is not a sign of strength. Historically, it is the symptom. The moment a state stops questioning whether its monetary model is sustainable and starts asserting that it obviously is, that is when the late-cycle logic has fully taken hold. So what are the warning signs, translated into observable mechanics rather than predictions? First, watch the gap between stated debt and real purchasing commitments. When unfunded obligations dwarf the visible balance sheet, the debasement pressure exists even before a single note is printed. Second, watch the velocity of money alongside the supply. A currency that is growing in supply while also turning over faster is a currency whose holders are already losing confidence in its store of value, even if no one is saying so publicly. Third, watch which currencies foreign central banks are quietly accumulating or quietly reducing. The sterling to dollar handover was visible in reserve data years before the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 formalized American monetary dominance. Britain's share of global reserves had been declining through the 1930s as the dollar's share grew. The ledger knew before the diplomats announced it. And fourth, watch whether a government's borrowing is increasingly absorbed by its own central bank rather than by outside creditors. That is the structural signature of every terminal debasement, from Rome to the Reichsbank to the assignat printing houses of revolutionary Paris. These are not trading signals. They are historical patterns made visible in the present tense. The ledger is not sentimental. It does not care which flag flies over the treasury or which ideology wrote the budget. It records what was borrowed, what was issued, and what was promised, and it presents the bill on its own schedule. Every empire in this story believed it was managing the process. Every empire found, eventually, that the process was managing it. The currency absorbed the consequences first, quietly, incrementally, and then all at once. The institutions followed. The geopolitical order followed after that. The currency dies before the empire does. Subscribe to see the warning signs before they make the history books.